folks, to the first amazing event of the 2018-2019 Visiting Writers Series. We are so fortunate to have these three amazing women giving workshops here tonight. But today we have Rachel Morgan, who is going to give a poetry reading. To introduce her properly will be Wyatt Nevins. But first, what we do here now in the English department is that we acknowledge the land that we're on is actually important in many, many ways. So we acknowledge that we're gathered today on the traditional homelands of the Palos Band of Indians and the ceded lands of the Nez Perce tribe. We further acknowledge their presence here since time immemorial and recognize their continuing connection to the land, to the water, and to their ancestors. I love that we do that now. Also, I'd like to thank the Student Entertainment Board, my awesome and ever so reliable intern, Wyatt Nevins. Let's give it up for Wyatt. My co-director, Debbie Lee, Karen Weatherman, director of the first year programs and co-director of the Common Reading Program, the Department of English, and our three amazing women, Vaughn Fielder, Rachel Morgan, and Carrie Salerno. There's a few announcements I'd like to make. One, if you need to get a common reading stamp, because we're so packed in here today, what I think we'll do is, if you could, when things have concluded, if you could go through this door and Karen Weatherman will have all things set up to take care of that. Rachel will give a reading and leave time for a Q&A, so please stay for that. That's actually one of my favorite things that we do. Also, Rachel will have books for sale after the reading, after the Q&A. They're $10 a piece. Cash or check is great. And Wyatt, would you like to come up and introduce Rachel?
All right, so Rachel Morgan is the assistant poetry editor for the North American Review, the oldest literary magazine in the country, and she teaches creative writing at the University of Northern Iowa. Founded in 1815, the North American Review is one of the most culturally significant literary magazines in the United States. Morgan is also the author of Honey and Blood, Blood and Honey, of which Cynthia Marie Hoffman writes, "These poems bear witness to duality of illness, both miraculous survival and tedious routine. The parent whose treatment lies in withholding, the physician whose cure is born from death. But there is no question of blood, because at the center of the medical research, the blood glucose levels, the mother scraping rice and bread into the trash can, stands a little boy in Spider-Man pajamas." Morgan is also co-editor of Fire Under the Moon, an anthology of contemporary Slovene poetry published by Black Dirt Press. Her association with the North American Review stands out to me personally. Working for Landscapes, WSU's literary magazine, I'm familiar with how challenging the work can be. Working as an editor on a magazine that has published work since before the Civil War is something anyone interested in publishing dreams of. The scope of literature from the North American Review is unparalleled, as is the skill of the staff. Works of poetry in particular are difficult to find, edit, and above all else, create. There's a lot to learn from a poet and editor working for a publication of this caliber. We couldn't be happier to have Rachel Morgan on campus this week. Thank you.
Thank you, Wyatt. We once got a complaint letter from Thomas Jefferson. We weren't getting him his magazine fast enough. So, not sure that's something we want to brag about, but we've been around a while. Thank you for that mindfulness about where we are as we are here today. And thank you guys. I know there's lots of places you could be apparently enjoying the first rain in a long time, but you're here. Thank you formally to Kim Berwick, to the English department here, and to the Common Reading Program for having me. You're here for a poetry reading, but you're also going to get a little bit of history and a little bit of biology. This little chapbook is a lot of what I'm going to be reading from, and I didn't know it, but I guess I started writing it about 5 years ago when my son, who was 3, was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, and it completely blew us away. It didn't run in the family. I didn't know what it was. And as any paranoid, overreactive mother does, I stopped doing everything and did a deep dive into how do I care for him. So I took a year off and spent a lot of time reading about the history of type 1. And so I would read things like contemporary case studies, historical case studies, perhaps most movingly, letters from patients, contemporary medical trials, and a lot of biographies about two healers that I'll tell you about, Frederick Banting and Elliot Jocelyn. Because before insulin was invented in 1921, diabetes was fatal, type 1. You would be diagnosed, and if you were unfortunate, you would live maybe 2 weeks. And if it was fortunate and you were caught early, you could live for 2 years, but it was an absolutely miserable existence of what they called the starvation diet, where you would lower your carbohydrate intake to eat about 300 calories a day that would subsist of things like a little bit of whiskey and milk and thrice boiled cabbage. And this usually happens to young people. So I spent a lot of time thinking about this history and trying to figure out, well, where does my son fit into all of this? And I think I approached it that way because first and foremost, I'm a writer. And what emerged from it is this little collection, and I'll read to you guys a little bit from it. You might be coming from lunch, so we'll open with the grossest poem first. In diabetes, what happens is the sugar that you take in, whether it's 1 or 2, can't enter your cells. And so the only way for the body to get rid of it is for you to pee it out. And before we had our really nice modern science where you could just prick your finger and check and see, physicians, who were oftentimes barbers or other folks, would have a job what they called a water taster, and that means that they would drink a patient's urine to see if it tasted sweet. That was one of the diseases that they would diagnose type 1 or type 2 with, and was pretty accurate. Another thing that they would do is they would collect urine and cast it out and wait and see if ants and bees would come to it for the honey that it contained. And so these people were known as water tasters. If you suspected that you had this illness, you would go and visit a water taster. Water taster. The start of a river is really a mountain. An antibody is the smoke of a more genuine fire. Looking at a still life, the boy sees a man living in a well, a withering orange decaying imperceptibly on a wrinkled tablecloth. Of course there is a forest. Taster of rivers, detecting trout, last season's snowpack. When you cast out the remainder, does it draw ants? Taster of water, kisser of wives, detective of excess. Are you always repartitioning the sweetness barrier? The smoke is sugar, draining patients of more fluid than they can consume. There are few cruder instruments than divining tongue to proclaim flesh and limb will melt to urine. Tell me if it's river or mountain you detect. Is it true I'll ration every sweetness I ever give him? My son is 8 now, and he might be one of the funniest people I've ever met. He deserves a writing credit because there are 2 lines in this poem that I took completely from him. And you can tell because they're probably the only funny lines I've ever written. My son tells a joke. I have 2 pieces of bad news, he bellows half the house away. The first news is there is no good news. He collapses in carillon laughter. The house is a soup of laundry, toys, half-read books, a way station before tomorrow. The oak leaves, clumsily curled into brown cradles and nimble air, slip through the kitchen windows before they're locked for the season. I scrape what's left over from dinner into the trash can. The silence of his noticing consumes the kitchen. If there's leftovers, are there right-overs? He's not sure whether to laugh, if he's unearthed something funny or tragic, me hiding the excess, a rationer of rice and bread, giving him less and banishing the rest. one of the figures that I became fascinated with was Frederick Banting. And to me, he's absolutely a hero. And I read a lot about, my mom is also a nursing professor, so it's pretty common for us to have like some medical talk and conversation. And there was the invention of insulin, which then won the Nobel Prize in 1923, the discovery of antibiotics. And then people are saying, well, what's the last disease that we've cured? You know, I'm not sure that we do, right? We can give vaccines, we can create treatments, but do we cure things? And it's a really interesting question. Banting himself was a Canadian physician, and he happened to also be a very good soldier. So when World War I came about, he volunteered and was a field surgeon. And there was a really, really long battle, and it was a 19-hour long battle, and he himself was wounded in his right arm and then continued to do surgeries behind the battlefront until he passed out mid-surgery. And then his arm was healed, and the war ended, and he came back to Toronto and wasn't able to find work there. He was hoping to get in at Toronto's Hospital for Sick Children, which was the best hospital in Canada in the day and age. So he moved to rural Ontario and established a business, but he had trouble with it. I think today that we would probably recognize that he suffered from PTSD and alcoholism. And so in order to close the gap, the monetary gap between the lack of patients that weren't coming through his office, he would take little lectureships where he would go into physician schools and do like a day-long lecture on something. And so this is the complete apocryphal story of how he came up with this idea of insulin. It was Halloween night. He was heavily drinking, preparing for a lecture on metabolism, something that he admitted that he didn't know a lot about. And about 2 a.m, he writes down ligate, means like to tie off, the pancreatic ducts of dogs. And then he spelled diabetes wrong. And then he went to sleep, forgot he wrote down that note. A couple days later, came across it, and he's like, hey, there's something here, because he was responding to an article already in existence. And so he takes it back to Toronto, the place that he wanted the job initially, and shows it to this guy, McLeod. And McLeod's like, hey, this looks great. I'm going to go to Scotland. Here's some dogs and a medical student named Charles Best. Good luck with that. And so they give him like 6 months to do that. And it's actually during this time that they start to be pretty successful. Banting was notoriously bad at science, about creating a control group. And so all these letters are like McLeod like yelling at him from Scotland. And then, but what he was really good at is being a surgeon. And so they think that's why he was successful. I am going to tell you something else gross. So part of the surgery of a pancreectomy is to scrape it off. So he would actually use his fingernails to go in there and scrape the pancreata of the dogs away. And he was really good at it because he had great technical skills. But he was troubled. He was drinking a lot. And even one time he talked about drinking some alcohol, like for the lab experiments. And in a lot of these books, I write kind of letters to Banting. And I think, what are the kinds of letters that we used to write before email? And so these letters take some of those forms. Intervention letter thought to Frederick Banting, heavy drinker. The other side of causality is blame. The lake effect cold is early pushing its season, and there's the 2 a.m. epiphany that confirms everyone's own suspected genius. The determined sour gut attempting sleep that knows little of its inheritance. Stretchers are wheeled like prams, and cocoon-thin children are hungry for even a bird's seed. The other side of blame is not causality. Banting, your actions have hurt no one and someone in the following ways. Of a rented room in Ontario, single bed, $1 patent for insulin, floral funeral parlor carpet. Of the first months in the lab, bloody apron, spectacles, heat wave. Who's counting how many more if it's only the next one? A black book boils with ideas for experiments. A room full of comas for parents to mourn. When patient and doctor are equally starving, there's one treatment option. Son of man, can these bones live? Son of man, these bones can live. Son of bone, these men live. Son whose bones my bones made live can live. So when Banting sold the patent to Eli Lilly, he said, it doesn't belong to me, it belongs to mankind. And he sold it for $1. And then there was an open year for anybody who wanted to investigate it could get the kind of instructions on what they've been doing. Well, now my son uses an Eli Lilly insulin, a vial. This much costs $300. Insulin is one of the 10 most expensive liquids now on earth, and there's a lot of evidence that there's been price fixing going on with Big Pharma. So I think it's really interesting that we've taken this thing that Banting thought this is for the good of humankind, and as we tend to do, he's monetized it, or Big Pharma has monetized it. These two poems are in the center of the book, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about diabetes and what does it mean. And when I want to simplify it, when it feels overwhelming, what I think about it means is like, oh, it's just my job to put more sugar in his blood when there's not enough or take it out when there's too much, right? And we have insulin and sugar and water to help us with that. Interestingly enough, the word diabetes mellitus, diabetes is the Greek word for siphoning, and then mellitus is the Latin for honey or sweetened. So you're siphoning sweetness is what the disease means. And I'll read it because you can hear it better. But the first line in the first poem becomes the last line in the second poem. I'll read it back to back with a pause in the middle. Honey and blood. A theriac arrives carried close to the chest. A vial delivers an antidote to poison. After onset, then duration. What leaves left, what returns was present, what never spoils is sweet. The epic of bestiaries is past. Bees are the smallest of birds. Honey is the sweetest of liquids. Blood is the air and water of life. Blood and honey. Blood is the air and water of life. Honey is the sweetest of liquids. Bees are the smallest of birds. The epic of bestiaries is past. What never spoils is sweet. What returns was present. What leaves left. After onset, then duration. A theriac arrives carried close to the chest. A vial delivers antidote to poison. So the other person that I kind of became fascinated with is this American doctor named Elliot Jocelyn. And I'm not sure he ever slept. He cared for patients prior to the invention of insulin, which was a really tough scene. And so in 1917, he published this book. Wait for it, this is going to sound like good summer reading, which I did. The Treatment of Diabetes Mellitus with Observation upon Disease based upon 1,300 cases. I didn't read all 1,300. I read actually about 200. But what Elliot was a really careful collector. And before we had, automobiles, planes, and the ease of traveling, a lot of patient-doctor therapy was done through the post office, through letters. And maybe once every couple of years you would come in and visit your doctor. And so Elliot kept careful records of these. He died in his office in his 90s. And Elliot was so successful, I think, because he was such a careful record taker. He genuinely cared about his patients, but this guy was crazy strict. He was like super Spartan in his diet. I would read these letters that he would write to like little girls who were like, "Dear Dr. Elliot, today I had 3 raw cabbage leaves and they tasted delicious. I watched my friends eat a candy cane at Christmas." And he like writes them back with like great congratulations for their moral character. He says fun things like, work shortens the day, but lengthens the life. So in all of his epigrams, he comes off as kind of like judgy in some of these, but I know that many patients lived specifically because of him, because of what he counseled. So he continued to practice. They called him a diabetesologist. We now call him endocrinologist, but he continued to practice up until the 60s. And one of his most famous patients, it was actually the first American to receive insulin. His name is James D. Havens, and he's one of the longest people that survived without insulin because he was prior to 1922. And he lived in upstate New York, and he was bedridden. You're very, very weak when your blood sugar is high. And so he would lie there and sketch these images from his bed. And his letters were happy. He had a lifelong correspondence with Elliot. So at 14, he received insulin. And then in this letter, he writes to Elliot and describes his beautiful daughter. He actually brings his daughter in to meet Elliot. And he became one of the, he kind of revived American woodcutting. You can see a lot of his stuff in the museum. And I think it's because, you know, he had so much time to sit and regard the way that things were created. So I have a series of case number poems in here. Case number 306. After the work of James D. Havens, artist, reviver of American woodcut, also the first person in America to receive insulin in 1922. He studies the gaunt spring green vine of a morning glory curling around Carolina corn, a deep New England snow bending branches to fences, so heavy the morning after it fell, a bride's veil that's river long. 3 birds perch on a branch, the same red as his red-haired daughter. He carves this line for a branch, for ferns, sharpens the steel needle against a whetstone, first to inherit history from below, a snowfall so deep the snow is sky and the sky is snow. In this poem, I take one of Eliot's epigrams and turn it into an epigraph for the poem. Case number 44. Laugh and grow fat, grow thin and laugh longer. Epigram from Jocelyn's The Treatment of Diabetes Mellitus, 1917. The parable of the apple tree and bee teaches that bees pollinate the blossoms and eat the rotten fruit. The last lesson a parent gives is how to die well. So hold this apple firmly. See it for what it is, alpha and omega, the dis-ease of disease, bitter before sweet. An islet anchored to its island is more alone together, one person who makes another, who was made by another. In the parable, there's an apple, a tree, a woman. Every choice provokes another end, to perceive evil because of good, a cup we fill so often it's never stored in a cabinet. So back to Best and Banting in the labs. MacLeod is in Scotland. He's actually studying fish insulin. He thinks that's the way forward. And he's like, who are these 2 monkeys that I have over here? This is awful. And they run out of dogs because they don't have somebody to help them in the lab. And we're talking about animal experimentation, right? They don't have somebody to help them. There's a record heat wave in Toronto. So before they can depancreatize the dog and deliver what they call the pancreatic extract, which we now understand as insulin, these dogs were dying from bacterial infections. And so during the day, Banting and Best would run these really scientific experiments, bury the dogs, and then at night they would go out on the street of Toronto and round up stray dogs to take them back to the lab. And in one apocryphal story, Banting has been drinking and he takes his necktie off and he ties it around the dog to use as a leash to take it back to the lab for the morning. Thank you, letter thought to Frederick Banting, killer of dogs. The trouble after my son's birth foreshadowed his life. A grumbling thunderstorm that arrived all afternoon, but the future is a long time ago. I only mention this to you, Dr. Banting, because for a while I forgot how to be, but remembered after a year. Easter eggs, goldfish, preschool, outgrown instead of never worn shoes. After I read of you and Best chasing stray dogs in the street of Toronto to depancreatize. Of course, this is the risk-benefit analysis, the price of science, cure, remission, faux pas, dead dog, rat, monkey, not child into child and child after child. It's the lean and hungry, the erstwhile dead that we've inherited. Over a shaky drink of late nights into half days, you and I name what famous people we'd invite to dinner. Now that people can eat dinner, now that the dogs are dead, now that my son lives. A lot of people on insulin therapy will wear a pump a lot of times in their waist, so that gloss makes sense for this poem. Not to dance around it. There are castles and dragons, and in last night's bedtime story, a night. We are a storytelling species, but I haven't told you that you're often only a cupcake away from a coma. When you figure this out, we can talk about it. I'll hear you pad downstairs in Spider-Man pajamas. You materialize past the newel post. Insulin pump, a swinging pendulum pinned in a newborn sock at your waist. Likely I'll be loading the dishwasher or sending work emails. You'll ask for water, our fingers touching. I let go slowly to make sure you can assume the task. My job has always been weaning you to make me obsolete. But before I am, please know I'd trade my life for yours. This book has been out about a year, and I've been reading from it at places, and I've learned that diabetes poems are sad. They're sad. And so I'll read a few other things and then be open for questions. I teach in Iowa, and usually one of the first questions my students, if they're brave enough to ask me a question, will be like, "You're not from here, are you?" Because they can hear a different accent. I was born in the Appalachian Mountains. I grew up talking like this. It's fascinating. I love to go back home, and my grandparents in particular, I think about their voices now more than ever, now that they're gone. And they would say hit for third person, like his, her, hit. And that used to be towards the end of Middle English before we moved it to it. And there's a school close to where I'm from called East Tennessee State University that has a partnership with Oxford, and there would be some sort of usually like somebody studying languages, particularly Appalachian speak, because one of the theories is that's the way that people used to speak around 1700 when folks from England were immigrating to the U.S. And this is just like a little praise poem for, I guess, the memory of hearing my grandparents talk. Song for story. For the story was a song, curled, whittled, shaving. It is false to name this hobby, a toy boat to emerge and sail downstream. For once the song was story, a woe so full even a shovel could not dig its hole. And the shavings offered scripture over the absent, its tools, knife and fiddle, both far from home. But like every wish, the song is sent over a sea. A Jesus is hoped, a dead is lived. Airy ever who and ever what come knockin', for every story loses its teller. Knowing where we came from was important to my mother and her sister. And so over spring break in elementary school, we would go to county seats, and this is before the internet, look up, birth, death, marriage records, and then go to like tiny little cemeteries in Virginia and Tennessee. Some kids got to go to Disneyland. I got to go to cemeteries and be the kid like with the crayon on the gravestone. And a lot of times there would be the graveyard would be next to the church, next to the river, where there would be a baptism. So this poem is about that kind of space. Baptism. Witnesses curl around one another as tobacco leaves drying in rafters, their bright umbrellas out of place, like penny gumballs against the river's bank. Over yonder, there are decapitated lambs, vandalized or eroded on the headstones of children, of infants. The newly baptized emerge from the river to the rain, from sinner to saint, neighbor to brethren, dust to dust. Last night, Kim was so kind to drive and pick us up super late, and we were talking very briefly about this, and I told her, like, I think I'm writing happy poems now. After thinking about all the diabetes stuff. And so I'm not sure. I think of them as happy poems. Maybe they are. But they still are kind of dealing with the realm of, like, when Sontag in Illness's Metaphor talks about what is it to occupy a space between illness and health, you know? And I think of these as happy poems, so maybe they are. Okay. If gift. It would be wrapped in the wings of baby birds, not the colorful kind on get well cards, but the wild, brown, nest-worn kind, rare as the shiny green-blue beetle pinned in the exhibit hall, unimaginable and behemoth, like obsidian bones of extinct mammals, jagged antlers and bowl-small skull. When you open it, you ask, what is it? But what is it, you demand? Listen to its odd sounds, like songs broadcast through outer space, an ocean yawn of whales. When was the last time you stood by the sea or in any remote place, hair blowing like wild beach grasses, whose names are the names of my imagined children? Already, my body has made two bodies. Your body has made you sick, for which I blame my body. So I've gathered the shoals and open waters, myth-making an unscientific faith, the autobiographical dream where birds turn into rain or rain into birds. This if gift would be everything I could not give you and everything I already have, 10 times tenfold. I live, as I said, in Iowa, and May is the sweetest month. It's when we finish our semester for college. My kids are still in class all day, and the snow melts. So May is my happy month in Iowa. Early May, Iowa. This morning, I bought batteries at the chain drugstore on First Street. The predicted rain was recalcitrant, even proud. A relative announcing a secret everyone already knew. On its breath, the anticipation of crops and ornamental trees, the world petal-luscious. In the parking lot, a young Amish woman was sitting out seedlings for sale, probably planted indoors as the last snow fell. Most everyone has started their day, recently called from sleep, where again we learn to speak to each other, remembering what we want to say. I drove to work. It's the last time I'll see this semester's students. I want them to have a good life and tell them so. I ignore the rain. Next, meetings, grading, writing, leaving work. I hold the door for someone I thought I knew but did not. A friend ate dinner with us. My son asked me to sit with him. I told him no, then yes. Today I feel too much sentiment, which rests like a stranger's head who's fallen asleep on my shoulder. The bus ride is long, winding into mountains in a country I've only seen on postcards. Snowy alpine peaks, blue-eyed sky, red flowers. Everything is beautiful, and every turn threatens to wake us both. And I'll close with one more poem. And I live in Iowa, as I said, and there's a joke in that state, and it's that if you're an Iowan, you can't vote for someone until you've had them over to dinner, you've got their sign in the yard. Politics everywhere. Not to be partisan about it, I lived in the South, which meant, my vote might or might not count. I lived in Los Angeles for a number of years, which meant my vote might or might not count. So Iowa, a swing state, it's the only place I've ever lived where my vote counts. And it's nuts. You walk into like any restaurant, there's a picture of politicians that have been there, that are coming. There's like chalk stories on campus. It's unavoidable. And then after the last election, there's things are in the news. And I didn't think it would filter down to like little kids. My daughter's 10, my son is 8, and they had questions. Even like 10-year-olds, 8-year-olds are talking about this stuff. And as a parent, I'm like, well, how do I respond to that? How do I talk about that? And then there's also been a big call in the poetry community, like sort of Carolyn Forche's poetry of witness, right? If you can write, how do you go out and respond to this? Well, I couldn't. I was frozen for the longest time after. I could read, I could react, but I couldn't write about anything. And thankfully, just like sticking to that writing habit has helped me through it. But I don't think that my writing not necessarily responds to the current politics, except this might be the only way. And so this is that poem that I kind of wrote about. How do I process that with little kids? Still life at 39. They ask such questions now. The afternoon news program tells me stars are disappearing. We manufacture day all night, egos unstitching the darkness. I am so amazed at the times I'm actually alive. My answers about war and bad men sound like platitudes. A coastal disaster far from this farmland, living in a creaky house I didn't build, drinking water from a well I didn't dig. I am so amazed at all the times my children are alive. Like snow over the ocean, spring grass that's impossibly possible green, aurora borealis, the red embers of a fire glowing until midday. They open mouths, hands, belief spaces to swallow my analogies for headlines as we zip through town, their round faces in rear view reflection, another question surging, the next wave washing the scraps of shell farther from my useless hand. Silence is never an answer until it is. Thank you.
Before we take questions, I want to invite you all to change your major to creative writing, because if that didn't convince you, that was just amazing.
Thank you.
So we have a few minutes for questions. Please don't be shy. Ask away.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite poem that you've ever written? And if so, was it about diabetes or was it something with different topics?
Wow. Great question. I don't think so. Like, I think it was T.S. Eliot who said that like no poem is finished, it's just abandoned. I tend to like the poems that I'm currently working on, and then when I put it in the like finished away pile, it's a different space, right? And then when I come back to it, I feel like, oh, I wrote that, and I feel like kind of judgmental about it. The ones that I might be most proud of or feel the least like cringy about are the ones that surprise me, that I trusted it when the process was going on, and it felt less like I was driving the direction and let the poem take over. Those are the ones that I'm really surprised came to me and are still with me. Yeah. Good question. Yeah.
What was the most interesting thing you've come across in research?
Wow. I think, for me, visually, it was seeing letters from children. You know, these are like sick kids where they've drawn pictures or created greeting cards and they've spent days on them. and seeing that sort of stuff is amazing. I didn't know Supreme Court Justice Sandra Sotomayor was diagnosed with type 1 at 9. And she has an autobiography talking about, and it sounds really awful. You'd have to boil your needle, sharpen it on a whetstone. She talks about as a 9-year-old child learning to do that. And to me, I think the overall, rather than like the specific artifacts, those kid things, but the strength of children, it's this weird thing while they still have innocence and optimism, they can do things that break your heart, as an adult when you realize and you look at it, because they're maybe it's their lack of knowing or their lack of not caring how hard it is what they're doing. So really it's the artifacts with the kids, I think. Yeah. Yeah.
What was your own pathway into poetry and editing?
Our common reading book this year is about how technology is changing the world. How do you think that poetry is pointing us forward as well?
Wow, those are 3 good questions. My own, I come from like a medical background, and my mom was like, you will go to school to be a nurse or a doctor or a physical therapist. And I remember I was 2 years in, I had that declared major and I was miserable. And so an advisor said, let me take care of your schedule, let me sign you up with everything that's opposite. And I found myself in Rick Jackson's poetry class, and that just opened the door. And the editing, it came when I was in grad school at Iowa. It was the time when David Hamilton was at the Iowa Review, and he was a steadfast, generous person. And I think he was a real role model for that, for me, to see how do you read something. Editors, we spend most of our time telling people no, which is a bummer. So when you can say yes to somebody, when you can open the door, when you can tout somebody's work, that feels so amazing. And David was so generous in the way he said no. It felt like every no really hurt him to say it. The technology question, I think it was the Washington Post. There's been an article recently about how poetry is more popular than ever. I think some of it's politics. I think some of it is some of it is technology. That as we spend so much time looking at things, feeling fraught about the larger world, we're searching for things that give us meaning, and poetry does that. So I think poetry might be a good antidote to feeling sick with technology or overwhelmed with the news of the world. Yeah. Was it William Carlos Williams that many men can't get news from poetry but have died trying? Yeah. All right. Well, thank you guys for spending this time with me. Have a good day.
Thank you.